Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and oh my goodness, it's 4 headphone amplifiers. In today's video, we're going to do a roundup of 4 headphone amps that fall in a price range of roughly $1,100 US to $1,300 US. This shootout is going to feature the ZMF Homage, which is $1,200 US, the Violectric HPA V222, which is $1,300 US, the Schiit Mjolnir 3, which is also $1,300 US, and the Erzetich Perfidus, which is listed at €999, and here in late March of 2024, €999 translates to about $1,080 US. So we're going to call this roughly an $1,100 to $1,300 headphone amp shootout. I have reviews for all 4 of these pieces individually that you can find links to down in the description. So this is a very interesting price class of amplifier, and honestly I like all 4 of these amps. I think they are all pretty good, and I can easily recommend all 4 of them in certain situations. So stick around after shameless self-promotion to find out which situations I recommend each amp for and why.
Hello, I'm one of the reasons that Wave Theory can't spend all of his money on audio gear. He wants you to know that your support is vital for keeping the channel running. So if you enjoy Wave Theory's bussin' review riz and no-cap review style and want to encourage him to stay in the basement so I don't have to listen to his dad jokes as much, like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also send him a donation on PayPal or sign up for the Patreon. Links are in the description. Now on to the review.
Alright, real quick, let's just compare all of these from a specs standpoint. The Homage here is listed as a Class AB, and so is the V222. They are different approaches though, where the Homage is mostly op-amp based, and the V222 has some transistor and that kind of approach to it as well. Why they are both called Class AB, I am not sure. I'm really not an expert on amplifier topology, okay, but that is what the product literature on the websites for each claims. The Erzetich is claimed to be a Class A. It is also unique in this grouping in that it is only single-ended. All 3 of these others at least have balanced inputs. In the case of the Homage, it's a single-ended amp that has balanced connections on it. But the Erzetich is single-ended all the way through with no balanced connections of any kind. The Mjolnir 3 here is a straight Class A. It's either a single-ended Class A, and that does not mean single-ended in terms of like, is it balanced or single-ended, like that kind of a thing. It's single-ended in terms of like, it is the most basic kind of Class A amplifier, which is called single-ended design. Now, it also has a switch to put it into push-pull mode, still Class A, okay, but that gets a little bit more power out of it when it's needed. In terms of power output here, the Homage, the V222, and the Mjolnir 3 are all rated between 2 and 3 watts of output power at about 32 ohms. 2 watts for the Mjolnir 3, I think 2.2 watts for the Homage, and about 2.7 watts if memory holds up for the V222. The Perfidus is the outlier here in terms of it has about 150 milliwatts of output power, according to Blaz Erzetich, the owner and designer, the owner of Erzetich Audio and the designer of this amp. But he says that it outputs about 150 milliwatts of power regardless of impedance load. And I have found that to be mostly true. Like, its power output goes up way higher than you think it does, even as impedance load goes up, until it eventually just cuts out. Like, it can't handle something like a Mothouse Tungsten, and it struggles a bit with the Susvara as well. So it can't handle those extremes, but up through the HE6 SEV2, it's surprisingly powerful, even with that rather low-sounding 150 milliwatt of output power. Now, in terms of ergonomics, these 3, the ZMF, the Vio, and the Erzetich, have no preamp or line out on them. Okay, so they are just amplifiers with analog input and headphone output. The Mjolnir 3 is unique in this grouping in terms of it has a full complement of preamp outputs, both balanced and single-ended, if that is of interest and of need to you. All right. Also about ergonomics, you can kind of see one that stands out here, and that is that the Mjolnir 3 is the biggest amp here. It's not very tall, but it is wide and it's also fairly deep-ish. It also is the one that runs the warmest of these, to the point where it actually gets hot. Now, not like dangerously hot, but it kicks out the most heat output of any of these amplifiers here. So it is the least placement friendly in terms of like getting it on a desk or in an equipment rack or something of that nature. Just something to keep in mind. The other three of these are rather compact. They don't get super hot. The Vio and the Erzetich can get a little bit warm. It always feels like the Homage is basically never breaking a sweat. So they are very placement friendly in terms of where they can go on your desk or in your equipment rack or that sort of thing, unlike the Mjolnir 3 again. Other features that are on here, like the V222, and the Homage, well, excuse me, the V222 and the Mjolnir 3 allow you to switch between inputs. You have both balanced and single-ended inputs, and you can manually switch between them. So you have the option of connecting up to 2 sources with those, whereas with the Homage and the Perfidus, you get 1 input. Now, the Homage has both XLR balanced and RCA single-ended inputs, but only one can be used at a time. There's no switching between the two. So if you plug something into the balanced output, I believe it's going to mute the single-ended input. And ZMF on their website recommends that you use the balanced input anyway, just because most of the design apparently went into using that balanced connection. And that makes sense because most of the DACs that are out there that are priced in such a way that are going to be of interest to pair with these amplifiers have balanced outputs on them, and they sound better from their balanced outputs than they do their single-ended outputs. That does not mean that balanced DACs are better than single-ended DACs. It just means that those that are designed to be balanced sound better when used balanced than they do from their single-ended outputs. And that is the vast majority of DACs on the market right now. So that is one ergonomic weakness then of the Perfidus here, in that it only has a single-ended input, and a single one at that. So you can only use one source, and it's got to be single-ended. And again, because of the reason I just said, the vast majority of DACs out there, anywhere near this price that you would want to think about pairing it with this, are balanced in their design and sound best from their balanced output. So matching this thing to a DAC is going to take a little bit more care than it does the rest of the 3 amplifiers. Okay. But with that, I think that's a lot of the ergonomic pros and cons of each one. Let's talk a little bit about sound, and that's where things get really interesting. And some general thoughts on the sound here in this Shootout is, even at this $1,100 to $1,300 price point, we're still dealing with a lot of compromises, right? Because 3 of these 4 amps in particular have a pretty clear delineation to my ear in terms of, do they sound best with lower impedance headphones or do they sound better with higher impedance headphones? So what do I mean by that? These 2 right here, the Vio and the ZMF, are really more comfortable with high impedance loads. Somewhere in the 60 to 80 ohm range and up, these 2 start to really enter their comfort zone and sound like really excellent headphone amplifiers. The opposite is true for the Mjolnir 3. Under about 60 to 80 ohms, somewhere in that range, maybe more like 50 to 60 for the Mjolnir 3, but under that range, the Mjolnir 3 sounds excellent, and it's not that it sounds bad with higher impedance loads, but it does fall off a little bit in terms of its performance there with high impedance loads. The ZMF and the Vio also, they don't necessarily sound bad with low impedance headphones, particularly the Vio. It still sounds pretty decent, but they are not in their comfort zone. They are clearly more capable headphone amps with high Z loads than they are low Z loads. Now, the Erzetich here is interesting in that it's pretty solid for both low Z and high Z loads, but I will say that the one thing that I've got to knock it a little bit for sonically is it probably has the highest noise floor of these here, so that might bother some of you. It's not high enough to bother me, and I really only notice it when I hear it in direct comparison to one of these other 3 or from another headphone amp that I have in my collection of a different price that has a really quiet background. But again, on its own, not really an issue, but it is there and something that you should be aware of. Each amp here, though, does have roughly its own sonic character. The ZMF here is a very neutral, very kind of flat frequency response kind of thing, very neutral, but its presentation leans a little bit more towards clarity, and it leans just a little bit into the analytical side of the spectrum. I hesitate to just straight up call it an analytic amp. I don't think that's fair, but it leans that direction a little bit more, definitely more than the others here do. So if you like that kind of presentation, it's here for you. In that way, it is very similar to like a JDS Labs Atom or Element kind of amplifier. And there's good reason for that, because the Homage was a combination, or collaboration, excuse me, between ZMF and JDS Labs. So it has that very clean, clear, lots of clarity, but slightly analytical sound that comes with the Atom and the Element. But because it is significantly more expensive than the Atom and the Element lines, it does bring in a bit more of the natural and organic kind of presentation that these others have. Not quite to the level of these other three, but it takes a big step up in that characteristic as compared to those cheaper JDS amps that I just named. Now, the Mjolnir 3 will go to next because it's also more neutral and has a very quiet sonic background as well. Maybe not quite as black void a sonic background as the Homage has, but it's again more neutral in its presentation, but it brings in a healthy dose of smoothness and natural and organic kind of sound and timbre and presentation to it, more so than the Homage does in there. The Vio and the Erzetich are similar in that they are both a little bit warmer than neutral and a little bit thicker and kind of stereotypically tube-like in their sonic presentations. So again, if you like that kind of warmer, thicker, also very punchy and dynamic kind of sound, and you know, again with that like kind of tube-like thickness and syrupiness almost to it, not really, but leaning that way, then these two are a little bit better option there too. The Mjolnir 3 is also very dynamic and very impactful, and it sounds very powerful. It's just not quite as warm sounding as the Perfidus and the V222 are in that regard. So those are kind of like from a 1,000-foot view, like what the sonic presentations are of each of these. Now, all of them are a good, when they are in their comfort zone, driving the kinds of headphones that they are comfortable driving. They all do a very good job with resolution and like spatial holography and all of that sort of thing. They are all relatively big sound stagers. As price and amp goes up, apparently soundstage size starts to get a little bit on the bigger side. These all throw a bigger stage than most like amps that are say $800 US and lower. They also are all very good in lateral spatial separation and in imaging, like so side to side on that sort of thing. They're very good there. They do start to separate themselves a little bit in terms of how they handle the depth dimension. The two that are best at that, to me, are the Mjolnir 3 and honestly the Perfidus. The Vio is right behind them on that, and then the Homage brings up the rear in terms of the depth dimension. Not huge differences, again, but noticeable on that. All right, resolution, let's come back to that one. These three, the Vio, the Perfidus, and the Mjolnir 3 are all very highly resolving. And when they are driving a headphone that they are comfortable driving, which again can vary in type and in load type and that sort of thing, they are very, very hard to separate from each other in terms of their resolution capabilities. They can be a little bit different in their detail retrieval presentations, the Mjolnir 3 being a little bit more forward, where it pushes its detail retrieval prowess at you just a little bit, at least it does to my ear. And if you engage the push-pull mode on it, it does it just a little bit more than it does in its single-ended Class A mode. So that's something to be aware of. Whereas the detail presentation of the V222 and the Perfidus is a little bit more relaxed and pulled back, but it's all still very much there. So these three do a really excellent job of resolving things like room reverbs and ghost notes and like the texturing of instruments, like that sort of thing, like the zizzy sound, the rosinousness, or the zizzy sound of bows being dragged across strings. Excellent on these three. The combination of resolution and spatial holography on these three for like live recordings kind of give you a very nice you are there kind of sense and feel and that sort of thing. Now the Homage is a little bit behind these other three in those areas because again, it struggles a little bit with stage depth, which I think is also a little bit connected to resolution, and it's not quite as clear in its ability to resolve room reverbs or like zizziness of boson strings and subtle things like that. But it's not far behind either. It's still pretty good. All right, now to like talk about like what's the key selling point for each of these amps here. Let's start with the ZMF. It's a really good headphone for high impedance dynamic driver headphones. A really good amplifier, I should say. It's not a headphone itself, right? And it's got this output impedance selector switch, which has the ability to like kind of reduce some upper mid and lower treble glare and harshness on some headphones, and also can like give the presentation a little bit smoother and wetter kind of sound for high Z headphones in particular, if that is of interest to you. It really makes sense coming from ZMF because they primarily sell high impedance headphones, and this matches to ZMF and other high impedance headphones like a Sen HD600 series, HD800 series, Beyer DT880, you know, those kinds of things, matches to those really well. DT880 you'll have to detachable cable mod to be able to use with these outputs, but okay, once you do that, it's a good match for these headphones, okay? The Vio is equally strong, maybe just a hair better than even the ZMF Homage at driving high impedance headphones, okay? But it also does it with that warmer, thicker kind of presentation that's kind of stereotypically tube-like. Okay. The other thing that it does is has a lot of voltage output. So if you're interested in like that Modhouse Tungsten out there, which is a high impedance, low sensitivity planar headphone, I have a review for that recently. See the link down in the description. The V222 is the best option of these four by far. It is a very good amp for that tungsten series of headphones. So that is an interesting part for it as well. Let's come back to the Homage for a moment too, because of the four here, it is one of two that is a really strong amplifier for the original Focal Utopia. And that is of particular interest because the Utopia, at least here in the United States, is on the used market from about $1,600 US to $2,000 US dollars, right in that range. And if you can score a Utopia at that price, that's a killer deal. But now it's a notoriously amp-picky headphone. What are you going to get to drive it for any kind of a reasonable price? Here's a really good option for that, especially with the high impedance switch in the on position. I thought it did a really nice job with the Utopia. So that's another key selling point for the Homage as well on that one. So you get both of these two here, excellent for high impedance dynamic driver headphones. High impedance, generally I would say the Homage is really good for the Focal Utopia OG, if that's something you're interested in, and the V222 is really strong for the Modhouse Tungsten, which is quite rightly getting a lot of buzz out there, and so that might be of interest to some people too. For low impedance headphones, the Mjolnir 3 here is excellent. I found it to be a particularly strong match to those egg-shaped hi-fi min planars, the HE1000 SE, the HE1000 Stealth, the Aria Organic, things of that nature. It was also a very strong match to low impedance dynamics like a Focal Radiance is the one that I had on hand to try that with. It also does a pretty good job with something like a Dan Clark E3. That sounded pretty good on this and so forth like that. So as long as it's low impedance, this is a really good amp. It also just has like that very neutral but still smooth, but also like dynamically aggressive kind of sound for it there. But in terms of like being able to drive headphones, those hi-fi min planars that are easier driving just are just amazing on this amp. That brings us to the Perfidus. And the Perfidus here is really interesting because it has the least drawbacks in terms of headphone pairings. it sounds about as equally good with a Beyerdynamic DT880 as it does like an easy driving planar that with a lot of resolution like the HE1000 SE. Sounds very, very good for both of those. Is the HE1000 SE performance on it quite as strong as it is on the Mjolnir 3? Maybe not quite. Maybe the Mjolnir 3 is just a hair ahead of it on that one. Is it as good sounding as the Vio V222 32s is for something like the 600 ohm Beyer DT880, and maybe not quite, okay, just a little bit behind it, but the Perfidus is better than the Vio for low impedance loads, and the Perfidus is better than the Mjolnir 3 for higher impedance loads, so it has the fewest drawbacks in terms of headphone pairings. There's one exception that really jumps out at that to me, and is like, it was not a good match for the recent Meze Lyric 2. Just for whatever reason, those two did not get along. The Lyric 2, extremely amp picky, okay, and so that's not a good match. But there are two headphones out there that are notoriously amp picky, for which the Perfidus does an excellent job with. One of them is the original Focal Utopia. So, for the same reason the Homage might be of interest for you with that headphone, so is the Perfidus, because it's an excellent match for the Utopia, arguably even better than the Homage is, but the Homage has the advantage of being balanced and therefore being easier to DAC match, okay, and signal chain build. But pair this with a Hugo 2 or a Cutest or like a Socher Stack 1421, something like that, and you are off and running with that for Utopia as well. The Fostex TH900 series also sounds really good on the Perfidus, and that is another extremely amp picky headphone. And this one, of all of these four, is an excellent match to that headphone. So I really like the Perfidus, actually. Blaz Erzetich has let me hang on to it very graciously, and I've used it here and there to listen to headphones and do comparisons, and it has held up. It has more than held its own. It was the first of these four that I was able to hear, and it still impresses me, even in relation to these four, because again, like, it will power comfortably everything up through HiFiMan HE6 SEV2 in terms of power demand. Every time I say that out loud, I have to like go back and think to myself, am I sure that it powers the HE6 SEV2 well? Because it's only 150 milliwatt output, and yes, it does. It really does. Not going to handle Susvara very well, not going to handle tungsten very well, but all but those most extreme examples, and then a couple rarities in terms of pairings, like the Lyric 2, which is not a particularly good match for, but otherwise is very much a headphone generalist in a way that these others are not quite to in that regard. So, to me, the Erzetich has the fewest sonic drawbacks and fewest headphone pairing drawbacks of any of these four, but it has the biggest ergonomic drawback in the sense that it's single-ended only, and therefore it is DAC limiting in terms of which DACs that you can match it with. But when you get a DAC that it matches well to, it's a really, really surprisingly good choice here amongst these three. Now, as far as the other three, assuming you have a balanced DAC, again, which one should you go for? If you're primarily pushing low impedance headphones, Mjolnir 3, okay? Pretty easy on that one, in my opinion. If you're pushing high impedance loads, then you need to ask the question, which presentation do you want? Do you want more neutral and like a little bit more analytic leaning kind of thing? Or do you want warmer, thicker, smoother with a little bit more sub-bass impact and that sort of thing? Okay, if you want the former, go the ZMF Homage. If you want the latter, I would recommend the V222. Okay, but there again, all four of these amps are excellent. They are all very good. I can recommend all four of them easily for the right situation for some people. These are just my thoughts on where these fit both relative to each other and in the market and in terms of headphone pairings and all of that. I hope that you found this helpful. I really enjoyed getting to listen to all four of these amps. Okay. I'm the real winner here because I got to play around with all four of these. And again, they're all good and worth having in the right situation. So I'm Wave Theory. Thanks for listening to my thoughts and my roundup of these four $1,100 to $1,300 headphone amplifiers. I hope you found this helpful. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, leave a comment down below, check out my PayPal and my Patreon, and generally look for ways that you can help support the channel. Also check out my reviews of all 4 of these individually, which I will post links for down in the description. As always, thanks for watching and enjoy the music.